the forgotten vote that changed a continent. It happened quietly, with no crowds in the streets and no sense of urgency in the air. A single decision was made, recorded, and quickly overshadowed by louder events unfolding elsewhere. Yet that vote would go on to reshape the destiny of millions. This story matters today because democracy does not always fail with force or collapse in chaos. Sometimes it shifts direction through moments that feel routine, procedural, and easy to ignore at the time. The most consequential decisions are not always the ones surrounded by debate and protest. They are sometimes the ones that pass through without resistance, carried forward by indifference rather than intention. The vote took place during a period of exhaustion, when populations were tired of crisis. Leaders sought stability, and attention was fixed on immediate recovery rather than long-term consequence. Participation was limited, debate restrained, and expectations low. The political climate at the time favored pragmatism over principle, and the electorate had been conditioned by years of turbulence to accept institutional decisions without close scrutiny, trusting that procedural outcomes would reflect collective interest even when collective engagement was absent. To many, the choice felt technical rather than historic, framed as a necessary adjustment rather than a defining turn. Ballots were cast with little sense that borders, alliances, and identities were being quietly recalibrated. What made this moment especially dangerous was not manipulation, but indifference. When outcomes seem predetermined, engagement fades, and power concentrates among those who still care to decide, the mechanisms of democracy continue to function perfectly. The failure was not institutional but participatory, a withdrawal of attention at precisely the moment when attention was most needed. The result passed without celebration or alarm, quickly absorbed into policy and administration. Life continued. Headlines moved on and memory began to blur. Within weeks, the vote had disappeared from public conversation entirely, replaced by the daily noise of politics and crisis that dominates attention in every era. The speed with which it was forgotten was itself a measure of how little its significance had been understood. But beneath the surface, the direction of an entire continent had shifted, and history would only reveal its weight years later. In the years that followed, the vote began to exert influence in ways that were difficult to trace back to that single moment, as policies, alliances, and economic priorities slowly aligned with its outcome. Institutions adjusted quietly, rewriting frameworks and expectations to reflect a new direction, while the public remained largely unaware of how much had changed. Regulatory bodies, trade commissions, and diplomatic channels recalibrated their operations according to the mandate the vote had provided, treating its outcome as settled consensus rather than the product of low engagement. What once felt like a minor decision started shaping migration patterns, trade relationships, and political leverage across borders. The economic effects were gradual but cumulative, as investment flowed toward regions favored by the new alignment, while others experienced slow decline that seemed unrelated to any single cause. Leaders cited necessity and continuity, framing each adjustment as isolated and pragmatic, even as the cumulative effect grew impossible to ignore. No single policy change seemed dramatic enough to provoke opposition, but together they constituted a comprehensive redirection of continental priorities that no one had explicitly chosen. Those who questioned the shift struggled to explain when the turning point had occurred, because it had not arrived with drama, only with procedure. The absence of a clear origin made resistance difficult, because there was no villain to oppose, no crisis to rally against, and no moment of betrayal to point to. The change had been authorized through legitimate process, and challenging its outcomes meant challenging the system itself. As consequences became visible, frustration followed, driven by the realization that participation had been low precisely when impact was highest. The vote had not imposed change overnight, but had authorized it, giving legitimacy to a path that was now difficult to reverse. What made reversal so hard was not opposition, but normalization, as the new direction became routine rather than contested. Institutions, careers, investments, and relationships had all been built on the assumption that the current direction was permanent, and unwinding those commitments carried costs that made the status quo feel inevitable even to those who disagreed with it. The continent was moving differently now, guided by a choice few remembered making, and the cost of forgetting was beginning to surface. The conflict emerged when the consequences of the forgotten vote collided with reality, exposing gaps between expectations, and lived experience across the continent. Economic disparities widened as some regions benefited from a new alignment, while others absorbed its costs, fueling resentment and political polarization. Communities that had been marginalized by the shift found their grievances ignored by institutions that treated the vote's outcome as a mandate rather than a procedural accident. Debate intensified as groups sought to reclaim influence, challenging decisions they no longer felt represented their interests or values. Political movements arose around the demand for reconsideration, but they faced the challenge of opposing outcomes that had been legitimized through democratic procedure, however poorly attended that procedure had been. The buildup accelerated when external pressures tested the system, revealing vulnerabilities that the vote had quietly entrenched. Economic shocks that might have been absorbed by a more diversified continental arrangement instead cascaded through dependencies created by the new alignment, exposing how much resilience had been sacrificed for efficiency. The system that had been built on the foundation of the forgotten vote was optimized for stability under specific conditions. And when those conditions changed, the lack of flexibility became painfully apparent. Trust in institutions weakened as citizens questioned how such sweeping change had occurred with so little awareness or consent. Attempts to revisit the decision faced resistance, not because it was popular, but because reversing it threatened stability built on its outcome. The paradox was painful. The vote had been made carelessly, but its consequences had been built upon so thoroughly that undoing them now would cause more disruption than the original decision ever had. The question was no longer whether the vote had been wise, but whether the cost of reversing it was worth paying, and that question had no clear answer. The moment of realization was painful, because it became clear that disengagement had allowed direction without accountability. Democracy had functioned procedurally, but failed experientially, delivering outcomes disconnected from participation. The continent now faced a dilemma: accept a future shaped by indifference, or confront the cost of neglecting critical moments. The dilemma was not theoretical. It demanded a choice, and the choice would determine whether the lessons of forgotten vote would be learned or repeated. History had arrived at the point where forgetting was no longer possible. The climax arrived when collective awareness finally caught up to consequence, as societies recognized that a quiet vote had redirected their shared future. What once seemed insignificant was now understood as decisive. The resolution lies in acknowledging that democracy is not defined by dramatic moment alone, but by participation when decisions feel small. Power often moves most freely when attention is elsewhere. The lesson is not that every procedural vote deserves mass mobilization, but that the absence of attention creates opportunity for direction without consent, and that opportunity is always exploited eventually, if not by malicious actors, then by the simple mechanics of institutional momentum. This story matters today because disengagement remains one of the most powerful forces shaping modern governance. When people stop watching, direction does not stop, it simply changes hands. The transfer of influence from the engaged to the disengaged is invisible and incremental, making it almost impossible to identify the moment when it occurs. But the effects are unmistakable once they accumulate. The forgotten vote reminds us that outcomes do not require intention, only absence. History does not wait for engagement. It moves through whoever shows up. The people who show up when others are absent do not need to be numerous or powerful. They simply need to be present. And presence in moments of absence carries disproportionate weight. The future of any society depends on recognizing which moments deserve attention, even when they appear routine. The challenge is that routine is where most consequential decisions are made, precisely because routine does not trigger the alarm systems that dramatic moments activate. Building a culture of sustained attention is far harder than mobilizing for crisis, but it is also far more important. So what do you think? Are we paying attention now?